It is a privilege and a joy to be with you here this morning. A real privilege. Again, I'm Pastor Scott Shafer, and I come to you from the mountains of Southwest Virginia, up in Appalachia. It's wonderful to be here. As Pastor Herbert just mentioned, my father is with Highway for the Remnant Ministries, and approximately just a little over 20 years ago, he started taking sermons that he was doing in his churches where he was pastoring, and he would reproduce them on cassette tape. Anybody still remember those cassette tapes? Yes, I see. Yes, those cassette tapes. And he started handing them out to friends and neighbors and people that he knew, and pastors and other literature evangelists that he knew, and so forth and so on. Anyway, it started growing from there. We started getting phone calls and messages and emails from people that were saying, you know, we are not hearing messages like this anymore. We are not hearing messages like anymore. Could you send us more? That began to grow and to grow. And of course, the CDs or the cassette tapes changed to CDs. And now we're sending out a monthly CD. Somewhere around 2,500 a month are going out nationwide every month now. And the Lord worked it out after working in 4 different conferences. As a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, the Lord in his providence has now arranged it that I've been able to team up with my father and work with him with the Highway for the Remnant Ministries. And it is a joy and a privilege to be with you. I know Pastor Dan was here with you a few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, I think it was, maybe, at one of your camp meetings up at the Red Top State Park, if I'm not mistaken, some years ago. He really wanted to be here today, but could not make it, but sends his greetings. For those of you that would like to get this CD each month, there's out in the greeters table there's a little green card. If you want to fill that out and leave it with them or give it to me or whatever, you can fill that out if you'd like. Also, on Friday nights, we're doing a Bible study on the phone. Can you believe it? Bible study on the telephone. They're teleconferencing, and the number to get that is on a little business card out there as well. And I also have some other goodies here. Pastor Dan wrote a book about present truth, past and present, a little booklet that you can read and share with a friend, and they have copies out there at the greeting table as well. What a privilege and a joy it is to be with you this morning. But we are not here to talk about me, are we? We're here to get into the Word of God. So if you take your Bibles with me and join me in that Old Testament book of Esther. Esther is just 2 books before the book of Psalms. There's Esther, then Job, and then the book of Psalms. Today we'll be looking at the book of Esther, and I want you to look there at chapter 4. You remember and picture in your mind just a bit this morning, using a little imagination. Picture the scene of the brave young queen making her way to enter unannounced before the king. We know that story well, do we not? Picture her there with her maidens and attendants and her retinue, if you please. As she's there, she's making her way down those grand hallways of the magnificent palace. We can picture the beautiful gold shimmering in the sunlight, the magnificent tapestries glistening in the sunlight as well, as she made her way there for the moment of truth of her life, the crisis of her life, as she goes to enter and speak before the king. Everything was on the line. Everything was at stake. The lives of God's people were at stake. And as she makes her way with those attendants, she makes her way toward that palace throne room. She makes her way. She's thinking in her mind. Her mind is thinking back of the experiences she had had over the last several days, really before that. She remembered what a joy it was to grow up with Mordecai, raising her as his own daughter. She remembers the joy and the privilege of worshiping Yahweh and worshiping God there with Mordecai. She remembers then the diabolical scheme of Haman that had just opened up in the last few days and weeks. And you can read it for yourself in Esther chapter 3. It's interesting, it mentions there that Haman was an Agagite. An Agagite. If you go back there, remember the people that Saul, centuries before, had been told to execute and not save anybody, not even a sheep, not even a lamb. Remember that? And you remember he saved the livestock? And you remember that Samuel came, and you remember Samuel said, what is the meaning of the bleating of this sheep? And you remember then that Saul gave some lame excuse about how it was for the sacrifices. You remember that Samuel said, "Bring me the king that you have spared." And Samuel slew him right there, you remember. That the king of that, or the name of that king was Agag. Now here we are, hundreds of years later, and now Haman was an Agagite. He had a score to settle, didn't he? And there he had created this diabolical plot to execute all the Jews. They were going to do it in one fateful day. One fell swoop. They were going to kill all the Hebrews in one fell swoop. And of course, Esther gets the news. You can read the story there, how she finally gets word of, she doesn't know why Mordecai is down there weeping and pleading before the Lord in sackcloth and ashes. She finally gets word. She finds out what is happening. Now she's prepared for the greatest moment of her life as she goes to speak before the king on behalf of God's people. What a moment that must have been. What a moment that must have been. But this morning, I want you to see that Esther did not go unprepared. Not hardly. There were several things that Esther did to prepare for this moment. And there's no doubt in this preacher's mind that what Esther did to prepare will have significant meaning for God's people in the end of time, because it is very clear that in the end of time, God's people will be an Esther standing faithful for God. Do you believe that this morning? We may not be the king or queen of some great empire, but we are called to be faithful just as Esther was. What was the preparation that she had done? Take your Bible there in Esther chapter 4. And you'll notice there in verse 15, Esther bade return Mordecai this answer: "Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and do what for me? Fast for me for how long? 3 days and 3 nights. And then what does she say? I and my maidens in attendance will do the same thing, won't we? We will do the same thing. I tell you, folks, that must have been some amazing prayer services that went on during those 3 days. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what those prayer services were like? Pleading. She didn't go and join Mordecai and the praying Jews, although really she did in prayer and in mind and in spirit. She was with them in heart and mind. But there she was, praying and pleading. So step number 1, preparation number 1, there was that fasting and praying. And I believe very clearly that as we get so close to the second coming of Jesus, God's people are going to know what it means to pray together like never before. They're going to be praying. Look throughout history. Look at the times that God has worked great things and great revivals have been done. But it all starts not with a great preacher preaching, not with some elder doing a great thing. And there's all a little place for that, praise God. But it all starts with somebody on their knees praying for God. It all starts right there. Just a few years ago, I knew of a little church in West Virginia, a little tiny group of people there. They had a burden for their community in their area. And they decided to try the radical idea of praying together. You know what they did? Picture this. They decided to meet at 5 o'clock in the morning, physically meet together. And I don't know if they met at the church or someone's home or where they met, but they started to meet. And they decided that they were going to dedicate 40 days in prayer together. 40 days. You would think that after about the 10th one, they'd get tired. And were tired of all of that. Do you know when they got to the end of the 40 days, they were being blessed so much and enjoying it so much, they decided to go for another 40 days. And when they got to the end of that, that's when they ran their evangelistic meeting and baptized something like 10 or 12 people right there in that little podunk town in West Virginia. God can do amazing things when we pray in truth of God's word. As Pastor has shared with us already, there are great things that need to be prayed about. The church of God is facing tremendous crisis. God's people are facing tremendous crisis. This story in Esther is not just meant to be some kind of bedtime story to tell the children, as important as that is. It's far more than that. This story has end time implications. But God's people are going to be praying. They're going to be fasting and praying together. And that might mean picking up the phone every couple days or what have you and praying together with your brother, your sister, someone in church, a good friend. It might be. It might be taking your lunch break and meeting for 10 minutes, 15 minutes at your car, at the local park, or down in the lobby of your office building and praying together. It might mean meeting here in church a few minutes before church and praying. Whatever it is, God's people are going to be praying together. They're going to be Esthers. There's going to be Esthers who are praying and fasting. And that fasting is far more than just the fasting of food. Although I think in the 3 days there, I think that was with it too. In fact, she clearly says, tell Mordecai not to eat or drink for 3 days. But God's people are going to be fasting from the world. You ever wondered why, when it talks about there in preparation for the Day of Atonement, God's people were told there to, that uses the old English term, afflict your souls? What does that mean? That's the pleading with God. That's turning away. No wonder this hymn, the grand hymn of the church says, the things of the world will become strangely dim. Yes, there's a fasting that needs to happen among us, starting with myself and all of us. There's a fasting that needs to take place. The world has to be left aside. The world's never going to understand that. People are going to say, you've become extreme. You've become fanatical. You've gone off the deep end. Let them say what they're going to say. We want to stay focused on Jesus Christ and his truth. The fast, to leave the world aside. There will be times of prayer. We've just been amazed. It's been amazing to watch. In the highway, this is just one example, but the Highway for the Remnant Ministries on Tuesday nights, the people have been praying together on the telephone, all together in a teleconference. They first were reading the book Great Controversy. Now they're reading the book Desire of Ages. And then afterward, they've been praying together. We have seen amazing things taking place, not because we're so special, but because of what God is doing. There's going to be a level of prayer amongst God's people in the end of time that is going to rival the times of great revival and reformation that we have seen in the past. Those stories were not just meant for those times. Those times of revival were not just back then, but it is time for God's people to be praying and pleading with God to do tremendous things. Tremendous things. Yes, they're going to be praying. Think about those early Christians. Think about them there, up there in that upper room, praying and pleading. Do you know what the Bible actually says in the book of Acts in chapter 1? That Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there with them? Wouldn't that have been special? Can you see them there praying? And that's just one example of many. Think about through history, God's people that have been praying, and God has done mighty things. But again, we come back to the fact that it all starts with someone on their knees and pleading with God. Someone pleading with God and praying. I think of the book Great Controversy, page 464. There's a statement over here. Where was it here? Let's see. Excuse me. Page 464. Before the final visitation of God's judgments upon the earth, there will be among, notice she doesn't say there might be, there will be among the people of the Lord such a revival of primitive godliness as has not been witnessed since apostolic times. Can you imagine? To think about the joy, think about the privilege of being a part of that. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if the Lord did those mighty great things and you and I missed out on all of that? Missed out. What a tragedy that would be. What a tragedy that would be. All right, so Esther, number one, the first thing she did in preparation was the fasting and prayer. Step number two in her preparation before she went before the king is there in verse 16, still in Esther chapter 4, verse 16. She made, number two was she made a total commitment. You'll see it there at the end of verse 16. You know the words, if I perish, I perish. No matter what takes place, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the results are going to be, I'm going to make up there in my mind that no matter what happens to me, even if I die, it doesn't matter. I will stand true and faithful to my Lord Jesus Christ. It doesn't matter. It reminds me of more than 100 years before the time of Esther, when Daniel's three friends, you remember, they're standing there before Nebuchadnezzar. There's the fiery furnace. And what did those three brave men say before Nebuchadnezzar? Our God is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. But if he does not, it still doesn't matter if we are burned alive there in the burning fiery furnace. It doesn't matter. We are faithful to God no matter what. And folks, this is going to be the faith of God's end time people in the last days. There is no doubt about this at all. No doubt. No wonder Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. No matter what takes place. No matter what takes place. Could that be why? Could that be why in Revelation 14, it talks about the 144,000, and it mentions there that it says that they follow the Lamb, and I love the old King James English when it says, they follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. Isn't that beautiful? They know where Jesus is. They know where he is, and they're following him, and they're following him no matter what. It doesn't matter what the world says. It doesn't matter what other people think or do. It doesn't matter what other organizations or people or churches or people do. It doesn't matter what family does. Or dare I even say, it doesn't matter what your spouse does. It's you must make a determination to follow Jesus Christ no matter what. There's Esther, brave soul there, bless her heart. There she was, making her way past those beautiful tapestries, the beautiful gold glistening in the sunlight, attended by a retinue of attendants or whatever you want to call them. Making up her mind, if I perish, I perish. It doesn't matter. I must go in and talk to the king. The moment of truth is here. Too much is at stake. Too much is at stake for God's people. In fact, there was so much at stake, folks. You realize, well, let's do a little history here. You didn't know you were going to go to history class today, did you? Do a little history here. You remember that in Daniel 9, it says there that the 69 weeks and the 70 weeks and the 2300-day prophecy all started, it says, unto mentions there, from the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince, does it not? There in Daniel 9, 24 and 25. The commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, some historians and scholars and others have come along and said, wait a minute, you Adventist people, you always use 457 BC as the year to start that. But there were 3 of those decrees, don't you know? And they're correct that there were 3 of the decrees. And if you want to read them, they're all 3 in the Bible. I won't take the time to read them all to you this morning, but if you want to do some interesting studying, after the Jews, you remember, they were in captivity in the days of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. You recall that. Then you will remember that there was a King Cyrus. Anybody remember Cyrus? The one who rerouted the water, you remember, and conquered Babylon on the night of Belshazzar's feast? I call that the night of 1,000 drunken politicians, that they were there, you remember. And Cyrus is the one who did all of that. Cyrus made a decree, the first decree, allowing the Jews to go home. He did not want to do it easily. In fact, you talk about fasting and praying. There's actually a description in the book of Daniel that Daniel fasted, and I don't think it meant he didn't eat any food for 3 weeks, but it says he ate no pleasant bread. In other words, he ate a very, very sparse diet. For 3 weeks, there was a spiritual battle going on. So severe was that spiritual battle that it actually says in the Bible that Michael had to get involved. Michael is a term that's only used a handful of times in the Bible, and it's a name for Jesus. That is only when Jesus is in direct conflict with Satan. And no, Jesus is not an angel. He is the archangel, the commander of the angels. There was a 3-week spiritual struggle for Cyrus to make the first decree to allow the Jews to go home. There's no record that Daniel went back. I tend to think, and I can't prove this, but I tend to think Daniel was probably too old to make the journey. But I can see him there observing the Jews, no doubt, making their way back to the to the promised land, as it were. Cyrus had made that first decree. If you want to read that for your own edification and study, you can read it in the book of Ezra. It's in chapter 1. You can read for yourself Cyrus's decree there. That would have been well over 100 years, probably closer to 150 years before the time of Esther. Then a second decree was made in the days of King Darius. You will remember that the Jews that had gone back, remember they were trying to rebuild, bless their hearts, they're trying to reestablish, they were real pioneers, trying to rebuild Jerusalem. And you read in the Bible how a number of them there, they were trying to build, and their neighbors came along and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? You ever read that part in the Bible? What do these feeble Jews? They even made a mockery of them, and they said, you're going to build the walls of this city, and it's going to be such a weak wall that a fox could walk on the top of it, and as he's walking across the top, the wall will collapse. That's the mockery that they gave. But they got scared, the neighbors did, and they actually sent word to Darius, this Medo-Persian king. And they sent word back there, and they basically said, and I'm paraphrasing it, but essentially they sent word back and they said, hey, king, these Jews have come back and they're rebuilding. And you need to be careful. Do you know the history of these people and how they rebelled and the trouble that they've caused? You don't want them to rebuild. And so they put an end to the construction for a little while until Darius said, what is this all about anyway? He sent his servants into the old archives there, and they pulled out the record of Cyrus' decree. And essentially, Cyrus or Darius gave the second of the two decrees, allowing the Jews to go home. And it basically is just affirming what Cyrus had done and basically saying, let the Jews build. It's amazing how God works, isn't it? The providence of God. Leave these people alone. Let them build their wall. They have the kingly authority to build. And oh yeah, by the way, don't just let them build, but you're responsible for providing wood and forestry and lumber and so forth and so on to help them with the building project. When God moves, God moves. When he moves, he moves. Then we get to Esther. Esther, of course, you remember, goes in before the king. In the book of Esther, he's named, and he has an interesting name, and it's fun to say. His name was Ahasuerus. Isn't that fun to say? Ahasuerus. It is thought by many Bible scholars that Ahasuerus is the same as the historical Xerxes, the same one who tried to conquer Greece. And you remember, those of you that have watched the movies and so forth about the 300 Spartans, anybody ever done any reading about that? The 300 Spartans that stood in their way, and all of them died to the very last man, but took out a powerful lot of Persians with them. I was actually reading that Xerxes was so angry about this that he took the body of the leader of those 300 Spartans and wouldn't give it back for 40 years. That's the Xerxes. That's the Ahasuerus that Esther knew and was dealing with. Xerxes had a son. And he also had a funny name. His name was Artaxerxes. Actually, it gets better than that, folks. His name was Artaxerxes Longomanus. Isn't that an interesting name? Artaxerxes is the one who in 457 BC gave the decree for the third time for God's people to go back and restore and rebuild Jerusalem. But it does far more than just that. In fact, let me back up. If you want to read these decrees for yourself, Cyrus's decree is in Ezra chapter 1. Darius's decree is in Ezra chapter 6. But if you want to read Artaxerxes' third decree of 457 BC, that decree is in Ezra chapter 7. That decree does far more than just allow the Jews to go home. It allowed them to set up their own government. It allowed them to levy taxes. It allowed them to reinstate the priesthood and so forth and so on. That is why we as Adventists for a long time now, and rightfully so, have used 457 as the starting point for the 69-week prophecy, the 70-week prophecy, the 2,300-day prophecies. And the whole point of this that I'm making this morning is very simple. What would have happened if Esther had not been faithful when she was? And I know some of you might say, but Pastor Scott, God could raise up help from any place. In fact, hadn't Mordecai said just those very words? Esther, you've been called for such a time as this, but if you fail, if you quibble, if you're not faithful, God is going to raise up deliverance from somebody else. You got to love the faithfulness of Mordecai. Got to love that man. But what would have happened? In the days of Esther, already 2 decrees had been made. This would be probably a good 100 years or more after the days of Daniel. The third one was yet to be done, the third most complete decree, allowing the Jews to go home. I tell you, friends, it is powerful and it is imperative that you and I are faithful to the calling that God gives us. So imperative for God's people in the last days of Earth's history. All right, so number 1, Esther's first preparation was fasting and praying. Number 2, the second preparation was Esther's decision of complete commitment to the God of her fathers. And number 3, this gets interesting. Look at Esther chapter 5 and notice verse 1. Esther chapter 5, verse 1. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on what, ladies? Her royal apparel. Ladies, you'll forgive me here for just a moment, but she didn't look at her attendants and say, oh, just look in the back of the closet and pull out something there that hadn't been touched in several years. No, not at all. She put on her royal apparel. Folks, this has tremendous meaning for God's end time people. Tremendous meaning. God's end time people are going to be putting on their royal apparel, and you know exactly what that is, don't you? Does it not say in the book of Revelation, the marriage supper of the Lamb is ready, and his bride hath made herself ready? The marriage supper of the Lamb is come, the bride hath made herself ready. Think about it, ladies, on your marriage day. Did you just run out the day before the wedding and say, oh yeah, I forgot to get a wedding dress. I'm going out to get one. I wonder if I can grab one at the Goodwill somewhere. No, not hardly. That dress was purchased weeks, if not months, if not even longer before that wedding in many cases. Esther put on her royal apparel. And folks, this is where the righteousness by faith fits in so powerfully. God's people, in preparing to see the King, are going to be wearing the robes of Christ's righteousness. Not ours, but Jesus Christ's righteousness. But to do that, and I'm learning this more in my own life along with you, to do that, that means that you and I have to die to self. Yeah. That means that you and I must learn what it means to surrender to Jesus Christ. We cannot wear the robe any other way. We cannot have the robe of Christ. Self must go. Self must be debased. No wonder then that Paul said, I am crucified with Christ. What did he mean? He wasn't talking about literally being strung up and nailed to a cross. No, he was talking about the fact that we must daily be crucified spiritually with Jesus. I love it in Romans chapter 6, where there Paul says that we are buried with Jesus. We are buried in that grave. And just as Jesus came out of that grave, we can come out and arise to newness of life. The joy and the beauty that we can have. But it all starts, you see, there cannot be life without death. There is no crown without the cross. To learn to follow Jesus is to learn to taste his cup of suffering. And I know there are those who will say, but wait a minute, Pastor Scott, I thought the Christian life is one of joy. I don't think that the Christian life is one of sadness. And I agree wholeheartedly with you. But there is the cup of suffering. I think of Jesus there with James and John and their mother. Actually, only one Bible writer mentions the mom. But you remember their request of Jesus? Her request? When you come in your kingdom, can one of my sons sit on the right hand and one on my left? First, it sounds like an arrogant request, but mothers, you can understand that request. You know, fathers too. We can understand that in a human sort of way. What did Jesus say? I can see him saying it so tenderly and so patiently. Can you drink the cup? Can you be baptized with the baptism that I'm going to be baptized with? Do you know what this means? Because you see, salvation is free, and yet it will cost you everything. You see, but everything is really meaningless when you compare it to the matchless claims and the charms of Jesus Christ. It will cost you everything to follow Jesus. The world must be left behind. The world is not going to understand that. Many are not going to understand that, but it's going to require a complete and total submission and walking with Jesus. Can you be baptized with the cup? Did that dear mother, God bless her heart, there with those sons that Jesus saw, did she not know? Would she have said the same thing if she had known that one of those sons would be the very first of the 12 disciples to be martyred very quickly there in the book of Acts? James was executed. You can read that there. Remember when Peter was in prison and Herod was going to kill him too? And then Peter was led out of prison. You remember the angel let him out? You recall all that story? He'd already executed James, the first of the disciples to be executed. And by the way, I don't know that we can fully confirm this with every single one of them, but it seems through the mist of history that John is the only one who died a natural death. All the others were martyred in some way, shape, form, or the other. Every last one of them. Did she not know that one son would die a martyr's death, the first of the 12 disciples to go? Did she not know that John, while he would live the longest, apparently he was the younger one anyway to start with, but he would live the longest, but he would live many years and be banished to the Isle of Patmos out there, you remember, and face many trials and tribulations, but would be used of God in a powerful way to write the book of Revelation for God's end time people. Can you drink the cup? Can you be baptized with the cup that I've been baptized with? To put aside self, to walk with Jesus, to lay aside the world, to put on the royal robe. Put on the royal robe. And folks, I'm going to make this very clear and very plain. And some people get very antsy when we talk about this, but it doesn't need to be at all. This means also where character perfection comes in. Yes, talking to me as well. This is why we need to watch our thoughts. Thoughts lead to actions. Actions lead to habits. Habits lead to character. And I know many people say, but Pastor Scott, you don't know what's in my life. And I don't, but Jesus does. We all have the heredity. We all have the bent to one sin or another, or multiple sins in all of our lives. That heredity is there. The genetics are there. The beautiful power of the righteousness by faith message is that Jesus came as a human being and overcame where Adam failed. And showed us the way. Showed us the way. You and I can be reborn. You and I can be born again. We can know we can come from the newness of life in Jesus. It doesn't matter what those temptations were. You see, I believe that when it talks about the God's end time people, those 144,000 just before Jesus comes, it talks about them being sinless. It does not mean that they were never committed sin. In fact, I believe that there will be many among them who committed some great sins in their life, but they have been forgiven and have overcome. Don't let anybody, anywhere, anytime tell you that you cannot overcome sin. Oh, sure, if our own strength you cannot, that's impossible, forget it. But walking with Jesus and trusting in Jesus and wearing the robe of righteousness like Esther's royal apparel, we can wear that robe and we can be ready when Jesus comes. It can happen. The Bible promises that. It can happen. It can happen. But it's only when we walk by faith. She not only put on a royal apparel, but I want you to see an interesting little detail here in Esther 5 and verse 1. Notice that it says, it came to pass on the third day. Now, wait a minute. This might be, to many, be an insignificant little detail, but remember back in chapter 4, she told Mordecai to fast for 3 days and 3 nights? And let me ask you, dear Bible students out there this morning, did she wait for 3 nights and 3 days to pass before she went in to face the king? The answer is no. Why do I say that? Notice in Esther 5 and verse 1, on the third day. What you have here is a classic example of what the Bible refers to as inclusive reckoning. And I know some people get all bent out of shape about this, and they say, well, it was Jesus died on Friday. How in the world could he have been resurrected on Sunday? You can't get 3 days out of that. That can't be the case. And there's even those who teach, well-meaning people, who teach that Jesus died on Wednesday and was resurrected on Sabbath. It's very clear that the Bible uses what's known as inclusive reckoning. You don't have to have 3 24-hour periods in the way the Jewish mind thought. Jesus died on Friday. That was the Passover. Rested in the grave. Never mind that Friday was just a little portion of Friday. He died Friday afternoon. In inclusive reckoning, that's a full day. Does that make sense to you? Sabbath, he rested in the grave just as he had rested after his work of creation some 4,000 years previous. Early that Sunday morning was resurrected. And I know people say, but that's not a full day. We don't even know what time Sunday morning. Never mind, it was a portion of a day. That's 3 days. There's another place, and I forget the chapter right offhand, but it's in Luke, where Jesus tells Herod, he says, you go tell that fox. Isn't that an interesting expression? Tell that fox that today I will do such and such, tomorrow I will do such and such, and the third day I will do such and such. You see, you and I today, this is now Sabbath afternoon. To our way of thinking, 3 days from now would be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday afternoon. But in inclusive reckoning, you've got Saturday, this would be Sabbath, tomorrow would be Sunday, Monday would be the third day. Interesting, isn't it? Notice that it says, on the third day, she didn't wait for 3 days and 3 nights to pass. Then she was ready to face the king. Now, there's a couple of things that we must notice. Notice as she makes her grand entrance. Oh my. Notice she puts on her royal apparel, and where did she stand? There's a significant detail here. Where did she stand, dear students, Bible students? In the inner court. Wait a minute. Wait just a minute. If this story has end-time implications, and I fully believe it does, if it has end-time implications, then that means God's people are praying and seeking the presence of God, and they are there. They are in the inner court. We know all about that, don't we, as Seventh-day Adventists today? Are we not walking with Jesus in the sanctuary? Have we not moved there from the holy into the most holy place there in 1844? We have moved into no wonder, and I've already referred to it in Revelation 14, where it says there, God's people, they follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. In other words, they know where he is. They know that he's moved from one compartment to the second compartment, and he is there. And Esther was there in the inner court. It is there that she met the king. And it is there that God's end-time people will meet the King of Kings. There are too many today who want to detract and quibble and question and destroy and undermine the sanctuary message that we so hold so dear. Never forget that that is a fundamental pillar of the Seventh-day Adventist movement today. There's no doubt in our minds that Jesus was working tremendously in 1844. I know the people back then didn't understand all of that. They didn't. They were bitterly disappointed. You can read the history books for yourself. And I know that there are many who come along and they will say, well, Pastor Scott, how could they have been so foolish? You know, there's a text in the Bible that says, no man knows the day or the hour. And that's right, isn't it? There is a Bible verse that says that. How could that verse have just gone right over their heads? How did they miss that passage? And as one person said, when I was doing some literature evangelism work one day, I met a man in his yard. He was washing his car or something there, as I recall. And he figured out I was Adventist, and he knew just enough about Adventist history that he could probably make him dangerous. But anyway, he made the comment. He said, you Adventists got off on the wrong foot back then, and you've been on the wrong foot ever since. Interesting way of looking at it, isn't it? But folks, I submit to you that just as they missed that verse in 1844, another verse had also been missed many centuries before. Had not Jesus told the disciples what was going to happen to him? Can you not go back through the gospel record and, see countless examples, numerous examples, where Jesus said, the Son of Man must needs go to Jerusalem and be scourged and be crucified, and after 3 days rise again. He told them plainly. And somehow that verse just went right over the heads of the disciples. They still were thinking he was going to come up and set up an earthly kingdom. Still were thinking that. Next thing they knew, they had just had this beautiful experience in the upper room with Jesus. And next thing they knew, they're being rudely awakened out there in the garden as this unruly mob comes with sticks and staves and arrests Jesus. And who should be among them to kiss Jesus and betray him but Judas himself? Can you imagine what a shock that was to the disciples? And where do we find them over that weekend? They're up there hiding in a room behind locked doors, scared to death. I find it interesting, ladies. The men are all hiding in the room. These women are going back and forth to the tomb all the time. I haven't quite figured that part out yet. But there they were, scared to death. They did not understand right away. So, therefore, if the Adventist movement in 1844 got off on the wrong foot because of a misunderstanding, then you'd have to say the whole Christian movement got off on the wrong foot too. Just because we don't understand what God is doing does not mean that God isn't still working. The disciples thought everything had come crashing down around them. Everything they thought. And you can imagine what that was like. I mean, all their friends and neighbors were coming to them and saying, "You left your job and your family to follow him? He's hanging up there on a cross. You said he's the Messiah? What Messiah could be cursed of God hanging up on a cross?" Just as 1800 and some odd years later, those early pioneers in 1844, their friends and neighbors are coming to them. "Hey, it's the next morning. It's October 23. What are you still doing here? You quit your job. You sacrificed. You left your potatoes out in the field. You closed down your businesses. For what?" God was working in a powerful way. In a powerful, powerful way. All right, one more point from Esther. She's in the inner court of the sanctuary, or there in the palace. She's wearing her royal apparel. She's made her preparation. The first part of the preparation, number one, was her fasting and praying. Secondly, she made a commitment. Thirdly, she's wearing her royal apparel. But I want you to see in this amazing, amazing climactic moment, when you look there in Esther chapter 5, look at verse 2. She's standing there before the king. It says there in verse 2 of Esther chapter 5, "It was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. The king held out to Esther the golden scepter." Can you picture it in your mind? Can you picture it? He held out the golden scepter in his hand. So Esther did what? Does it say Esther ran out the back door and got scared, had cold feet, and ran out the back door? Does it say she said, "Oh, no, you don't have authority to give me that scepter"? Does she say that? No. Esther drew near and did what? Touched the top of the scepter. The moment of truth had come. The moment of preparation was there. She found favor in his sight. And I think with all the boldness and courage of God's faithful people throughout the ages, she reaches out and she touches the top of that scepter. And friends, even today, down through the ages and in these last days of Earth's history, God's people are not going to quibble or be afraid or lose confidence or lose heart in reaching out and touching and grasping everything that God has provided for them. The blessings are there. The privileges are there. The scepter has been handed out. Will you touch that scepter? Or will, like so many, want to run out the back door and run and hide? There are those today who want to run when the scepter is provided. There are those who say that we cannot overcome sin. There are those who destroy and weaken the sanctuary message. They're turning around and running out the back door. There are those who are weakening the standards of the Seventh-day Adventist movement. They're running out the back door. They're afraid and quibble and tremble and are too timid to touch the scepter. But God's faithful people are going to be reaching out for everything that God has provided. Will we reach out and touch that scepter? Will we reach out there? God's people in countless ways have been making commitments and making full surrender to Jesus Christ. They're making decisions. Many are facing the challenges, are losing their jobs over mandates or over the fact that they're not working on Sabbath anymore. Others are making a full commitment that they're going to say, you know what? God has called our family and we want to be in mission service for God in some way, shape, or form in ministry. And they're leaving everything and selling homes, houses. Have you seen that? It's amazing what's been happening amongst God's people. They're reaching out and touching the scepter. There are those who are being laughed at by fellow workers, even by family members, even, God forbid, spouses. And making a full commitment to follow Jesus Christ, making a commitment to become a Seventh-day Adventist Christian in these last days of Earth's history. And they are reaching out and touching the scepter no matter what takes place. They're going to accomplish great things for God. And there's no doubt in this preacher's mind that as we get closer to the second coming, God's people are going to be touching that scepter and accomplish great things. I believe that the stories in the Bible are going to be far surpassed by what's going to happen in the last days. Oh, the devil's going to have his counterfeits too. Don't misunderstand. He will. But there's going to be great things accomplished by God's people. Why? Is it because they suddenly figured out and got themselves all together? No. Is it because they've gotten suddenly all smart and wise in it? No. It's because they have learned what it means to pray and submit to God the Father. They've learned what it means to reach out and touch the scepter that Jesus provides. They've learned what it means to have all the blessings be poured into their hearts and minds and know that it's all theirs. It is all theirs. Not in a greedy way, you understand, but trusting in the power of what God is there. There is Esther, bless her heart, brave young queen, walking with her retinue of attendants, making her way past those golden, beautiful palace halls, the beautiful tapestries shimmering in the sunlight, all the courtiers, the officials, the advisors, the ambassadors, the soldiers, the generals, the servants, and whatever else might have been there on that fateful day, boldly standing before the king on behalf of God's people. No wonder the book of Joel says in chapter 2, for the priests and ministers to weep between the porch and the altar, pleading for a moment of crisis. Satan was trying in one fell swoop to kill every last one of God's people back then. That brings me to another thing. We need to bring this to a close, but it's interesting. There are those, and I've actually heard sermons on this, there are those who say that it is not important for God's people to vindicate the character of God in the end of time. They won't need to perfect characters and vindicate his character because his character was already vindicated at the cross. An interesting theology, isn't it? Very interesting. But folks, remember, it's always been about God's character revealed in people. There's always had to have been a faithful person. The line, the seed had to always be there. Sometimes it was a mighty thin line. Sometimes it was only 8 people on a boat, for crying out loud. But there they were, the faithful people of God on board that ark. There's always been sometimes it's very, very weak, and sometimes it's very, very few. And it's going to seem like in the last days, it is going to seem like at some point in your life, if not already, it's going to seem like you're the only one faithful to God left in this entire world. But never mind, God still has 7,000 who have never bowed the knee to Baal. It's always been about people vindicating the character of God, not because they've suddenly arrived, but because of what Jesus is doing. You see, God's people are going to understand grace in the end of time in a way that no other generation has understood this. I don't mean to declaim or criticize the understanding of previous generations. On the contrary, doesn't the Bible say that God's end time people will raise up the foundations of many generations? But they will understand the real meaning of what it means, what grace can do. Grace is power. Grace overcomes. Grace helps us to walk in his ways. Grace helps us, as Romans 8 says there, to fulfill the law of the righteousness might be fulfilled in us. That's grace. And it is grace that will prepare people to stand as we enter into the last phases of the investigative judgment before the second coming of Jesus Christ. So this morning, As we see from centuries ago, I leave you with the picture of Esther. Bless her heart. There she was, faithful young lady, faithful young queen, standing there, making her way confidently, assuredly, walking with Jesus and reaching out and touching everything that the scepter had to offer. That Jesus has to offer. Will you and I touch the scepter with her? Will we reach out in faith and touch it right along with her in these last days of Earth's history? With that in mind, let's conclude with our closing hymn this morning. I believe it's He Leadeth Me, 537. What an appropriate hymn to sing this morning. Number 537, He Leadeth Me. God's people are certainly going to pray that prayer. He leadeth me.